Chapters 60 through 63 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 60. "Forgeries!" cried Helen, with innocent horror. "Rank forgeries," repeated the expert, coolly. "Forgeries!" cried Helen. "Why, how can printed things be that?" "That is what I should like to know," said the old lady. "Why, what else can you call them?" said the expert. "They are got up to look like extracts from newspapers, but they were printed as they are, and were never in any journal. Shall I tell you how I found that out?" "If you please, sir," said Helen. "Well, then, I looked at the reverse side, and I found 7 misprints in one slip and 5 in the other. That was a great number to creep into printed slips of that length. The trial part did not show a single erratum. 'Hullo!' said I to myself, 'why, one side is printed more carefully than the other,' and that was not natural. The printing of advertisements is looked after quite as sharply as any other part in a journal. Why, the advertisers themselves cry out if they are misprinted." "Oh, how shrewd!" cried Helen. "Child's play," said the expert. "Well, from that blot I went on. I looked at the edges, and they were cut too clean. A gentleman with a pair of scissors can't cut slips out of a paper like this. They were cut in the printer's office. Lastly, on holding them to the light, I found that they had not been machined upon the plan now adopted by all newspapers, but worked by hand. In one word, forgeries." "Oh," said Helen, "to think I should have handled forgeries and shown them to you for real! Ah, I'm so glad! For now I have committed the same crime as Robert Penfold. I have uttered a forged document. Take me up and have me put in prison, for I am as guilty as ever he was." Her face shone with rapture at sharing Robert's guilt. The expert was a little puzzled by sentiments so high flown and unpractical. "I think," said he, "you are hardly aware what a valuable discovery this may prove to you. However, the next step is to get me a specimen of the person's handwriting who furnished you with these. The chances are he is the writer of the forged note." Helen uttered an exclamation that was almost a scream. The inference took her quite by surprise. She looked at Mrs. Undercliff. "He is right, I think," said the old lady. "Right or wrong," said the expert, "the next step in the inquiry is to do what I said. But that demands great caution. You must write a short civil note to Mr. Hand, and just ask him some question. Let me see. Ask him what newspaper his extracts are from, and whether he has got any more. He will not tell you the truth, but no matter, we shall get hold of his handwriting." "But, sir," said Helen, "there is no need for that. Mr. Hand sent me a note along with the extracts." "The deuce he did! All the better. Any words in it that are in the forged note? Is Penfold in it, or Wardlaw?" Helen reflected a moment, and then said she thought both names were in it. "Fetch me that note," said Undercliff, and his eyes sparkled. He was on a hot scent now. "And let me study the genuine reports and compare what they say with the forged ones," said Mrs. Undercliff. "Oh, what friends I have found at last!" cried Helen. She thanked them both warmly and hurried home, for it was getting late. Next day she brought Hand's letter to Mr. Undercliff, and devoured his countenance while he inspected it keenly and compared it with the forged note. The comparison was long and careful, but unsatisfactory. Mr. Undercliff could not conscientiously say whether Hand had written the forged note or not. There were pros and cons. "We are in deeper water than I thought," said he. "The comparison must be enlarged. You must write as I suggested, and get another note out of Mr. Hand." "And leave the prayer book with me," said Mrs. Undercliff. Helen complied with these instructions, and in due course received a civil line from Mr. Hand, to say that the extracts had been sent him from the country by one of his fellow clerks, and he had them locked up, lest Mr. Michael Penfold, who was much respected in the office, should see them. He could not say where they came from, perhaps from some provincial paper. if of any value to Miss Rolliston, she was quite at liberty to keep them. He added there was a coffee house in the city where she could read all the London papers of that date. This letter, which contained a great many more words than the other, was submitted to Undercliff. It puzzled him so that he set to work, and dissected every curve the writer's pen had made, but he could come to no positive conclusion, and he refused to utter his conjectures. "We are in a deep water," said he. Finally he told his mother he was at a standstill for the present. "But I am not," said Mrs. Undercliff. She added after a while, "I think there's felony at the bottom of this." "Smells like it to me," said the expert. "Then I want you to do something very clever for me." "What is that?" "I want you to forge something." "Come, I say." "Quite innocent, I assure you." "Well, but it is a bad habit to commence." "All depends on the object. This is to take in a forger, that is all." The expert's eyes sparkled. He had always been sadly discontented with the efforts of forgers, and thought he could do better. "I'll do it," said he gaily. 61. General Rolliston and his daughter sat at breakfast in the hotel. General Rolliston was reading the Times, and his eye lighted on something that made him start. He looked toward Helen, and his first impulse was to communicate it to her; but on second thoughts he preferred to put a question to her first. "You have never told the Wardlaws what those sailors said?" "No, papa. I still think they ought to have been told; but you know you positively forbade me." "Of course I did. Why afflict the old gentleman with such a tale? A couple of common sailors who chose to fancy the ship was destroyed." "Who are better judges of such a thing than sailors?" "Well, my child, if you think so, I can't help it. All I say is, spare the old gentleman such a report. As for Arthur, to tell you the truth, I have mentioned the matter to him." "Ah, papa! Then why forbid me to tell him? What did he say?" "He was very much distressed. 'Destroy the ship my Helen was in,' said he. 'If I thought Wiley had done that, I'd kill him with my own hand, though I was hanged for it next minute.' I never saw the young fellow fire up so before. But when he came to think calmly over it a little while, he said, 'I hope this slander will never reach my father's ears. It would grieve him deeply. I only laugh at it.'" "Laugh at it, and yet talk of killing?" "Oh, people say they laugh at a thing when they are very angry all the time. However, as you are a good girl, and mind what you are told, I'll read you an advertisement that will make you stare. Here is Joseph Wiley, who, you say, wrecked the Proserpine, actually invited by Michael Penfold to call on him, and hear of something to his advantage." "Dear me," said Helen, "how strange! Surely Mr. Penfold cannot know the character of that man. Stop a minute. Advertise for him? Then nobody knows where he lives. There, papa. You see he is afraid to go near Arthur Wardlaw. He knows he destroyed the ship. What a mystery it all is! And so Mr. Penfold is at home, after all, and not to send me a single line. I never met with so much unkindness and discourtesy in all my life." "Ah, my dear," said the General, "you never defied the world before, as you are doing now." Helen sighed; but presently recovering her spirit, said she had done without the world on her dear island, and she would not be its slave now. As she was always as good as her word, she declined an invitation to play the lion, and dressing herself in plain merino, went down that very evening to Michael Penfold's cottage. We run thither a little before her, to relate briefly what had taken place there. Nancy Rouse, as may well be imagined, was not the woman to burn £2,000. She locked the notes up, and after that night became very reserved on that head, so much so at last, Mr. Penfold saw it was an interdicted topic, and dropped it in much wonder. When Nancy came to think of it in daylight, she could not help suspecting Wiley had some hand in it; and it occurred to her that the old gentleman who lodged next door might be an agent of Wiley's and a spy on her. Wiley must have told him to push the £2,000 into her room. But what a strange thing to do! To be sure, he was a sailor, and sailors had been known to make sandwiches of banknotes and eat them. Still, her good sense revolted against this theory, and she was sore puzzled; for after all there was the money, and she had seen it come through the wall. One thing appeared certain, Joe had not forgotten her. He was thinking of her as much as ever, or more than ever. So her spirits rose; she began singing and whistling again, and waited cunningly till Joe should reappear and explain his conduct. Hostage for his reappearance she held the £2,000. She felt so strong and saucy she was half sorry she had allowed Mr. Penfold to advertise. But after all it did not much matter. She could always declare to Joe she had never missed him, for her part, and the advertising was a folly of poor Mr. Penfold's. Matters were in this condition when the little servant came up one evening to Mr. Penfold and said there was a young lady to see him. "A young lady for me?" said he. "Which she won't eat you while I am by," said the sharp little girl. "It is a lady, and the same one what come before." "Perhaps she will oblige me with her name," said Michael, timidly. "I won't show her up till she do," said this mite of a servant who had been scolded by Nancy for not extracting that information on Helen's last visit. "Of course I must receive her," said Michael, half consulting the mite. It belonged to a sex which promptly assumes the control of such gentle creatures as he was. "Is Miss Rouse in the way?" said he. The mite laughed and said, "She is only gone down the street. I'll send her in to take care of you." With this she went off, and in due course led Helen up the stairs. She ran in and whispered in Michael's ear, "It is Miss Helen Rolleston." Thus they announced a lady at number 3. Michael stared with wonder at so great a personage visiting him; and the next moment Helen glided into the room, blushing a little, and even panting inaudibly, but all on her guard. She saw before her a rather stately figure, and a face truly venerable, benignant, and beautiful, though deficient in strength. She cast a devouring glance on him as she curtsied to him, and it instantly flashed across her, "But for you there would be no Robert Penfold." There was an unconscious tenderness in her voice as she spoke to him, for she had to open the interview. "Mr. Penfold, I fear my visit may surprise you, as you did not write to me. But when you hear what I am come about, I think you will not be displeased with me for coming." "Displeased, madam? I am highly honored by your visit. A lady who, I understand, is to be married to my worthy employer, Mr. Arthur. Pray be seated, madam." "Thank you, sir." Helen began in a low, thrilling voice, to which, however, she gave firmness by a resolute effort of her will. "I am come to speak to you of one who is very dear to you, and to all who really know him." "Dear to me? It is my son. The rest are gone. It is Robert." And he began to tremble. "Yes, it is Robert," said she very softly. Then turning her eyes away from him, lest his emotion should overcome her, she said, "He has laid me and my father under deep obligations." She dragged her father in, for it was essential not to show Mr. Penfold she was in love with Robert. "Obligations to my Robert? Oh, madam, it is very kind of you to say that, and cheer a desolate father's heart with praise of his lost son. But how could a poor unfortunate man in his position serve a lady like you?" "He defended me against robbers single handed." "Ah!" said the old man, glowing with pride, and looking more beautiful than ever. "He was always as brave as a lion." "That is nothing. He saved my life again, and again, and again." "God bless him for it, and God bless you for coming and telling me of it. Oh, madam, he was always brave, and gentle, and just, and good. So noble, so unfortunate." And the old man began to cry. Helen's bosom heaved, and it cost her a bitter struggle not to throw her arms around the dear old man's neck and cry with him. But she came prepared for a sore trial of her feelings, and she clenched her hands and teeth, and would not give way an inch. "Tell me how he saved your life, madam." He was in the ship and in the boat with me." "Ah, madam," said Michael, "that must have been some other Robert Penfold. Not my son. He could not come home. His time was not up, you know." "It was Robert Penfold, son of Michael Penfold." "Excuse me a moment," said Michael, and he went to a drawer and brought her a photograph of Robert. Was it this Robert Penfold? The girl took the photograph and eyed it and lowered her head over it. "Yes," she murmured. "And he was coming home in the ship with you? Is he mad? More trouble, more trouble." "Do not alarm yourself," said Helen. "He will not land in England for years." Here she stifled a sob. "And long ere that we shall have restored him to society." Michael stared at that and shook his head. "Never," said he. "That is impossible." "Why impossible?" "They all say he is a felon." "They all shall say that he is a martyr." "And so he is. But how can that ever be proved?" "I don't know. But I am sure the truth can always be proved, if people have patience and perseverance." "My sweet young lady," said Michael sadly, "you don't know the world." "I am learning it fast, though. It may take me a few years, perhaps, to make powerful friends, to grope my way among forgers and spies, and wicked, dishonest people of all sorts, but so surely as you sit there I'll clear Robert Penfold before I die." The good feeble old man gazed on her with admiration and astonishment. She subdued her flashing eye and said with a smile: "And you shall help me. Mr. Penfold, let me ask you a question. I called here before, but you were gone to Edinburgh. Then I wrote to you at the office, begging you to let me know the moment you returned. Now do not think I am angry, but pray tell me why you would not answer my letter." Michael Penfold was not burdened with amour propre, but who has not got a little of it in some corner of his heart? "Miss Rolliston," said he, "I was born a gentleman, and was a man of fortune once, till false friends ruined me. I am in business now, but still a gentleman; and neither as a gentleman nor as a man of business could I leave a lady's letter unanswered. I never did such a thing in all my life." "I never got your letter," he said, quite put out; and his wrath was so like a dove's that Helen smiled and said: "But I posted it myself, and my address was in it, yet it was not returned." "Well, madam, it was not delivered, I assure you." "It was intercepted, then." He looked at her. She blushed and said: "Yes, I am getting suspicious, ever since I found I was followed and watched. Excuse me a moment." She went to the window and peered through the curtains. She saw a man walking slowly by. He quickened his pace the moment she opened the curtain. "Yes," said she, "it was intercepted, and I am watched wherever I go." Before she could say any more a bustle was heard on the stairs, and in bounced Nancy Rouse, talking as she came. "Excuse me, Mr. Penfolds, but I can't wait no longer with my heart a bursting. It is. Oh, my dear, sweet young lady, the Lord be praised! You really are alive and well. Kiss you I must and shall. Come back from the dead. There. "Nancy, my good, kind Nancy!" cried Helen, and returned her embrace warmly. Then followed a burst of broken explanations, and at last Helen made out that Nancy was the landlady, and had left Lambeth long ago. "But, dear heart," said she, "Mr. Penfolds, I'm properly jealous of you. To think of her coming here to see you, and not me!" "But I didn't know you were here, Nancy." Then followed a stream of inquiries, and such warm hearted sympathy with all her dangers and troubles, that Helen was led into revealing the cause of it all. "Nancy," said she solemnly, "the ship was wilfully cast away. There was a villain on board that made holes in her on purpose, and sunk her." Nancy lifted up her hands in astonishment. But Mr. Penfold was far more surprised and agitated. "For heaven's sake, don't say that!" he cried. "Why not, sir?" said Helen. "It is the truth, and I have got the testimony of dying men to prove it." "I am sorry for it. Pray don't let anybody know. Why, Wardlaws would lose the insurance of £160,000. "Arthur Wardlaw knows it. My father told him." "And he never told me," said Penfold, with growing surprise. "Goodness me, what a world it is!" cried Nancy. "Why, that was murder, and no less. It is a wonder she wasn't drownded, and another friend into the bargain that I had in that very ship. Oh, I wish I had the villain here that done it. I'd tear his eyes out." Here the mite of a servant bounded in, radiant and giggling, gave Nancy a triumphant glance, and popped out again, holding the door open, through which in slouched a seafaring man drawn by Penfold's advertisement, and decoyed into Nancy's presence by the imp of a girl who thought to please her mistress. Nancy, who for some days had secretly expected this visit, merely gave a little squeak. But Helen uttered a violent scream; and upon that Wiley recognized her, and literally staggered back a step or two, and these words fell out of his mouth: "The sick girl!" Helen caught them. "Ay," cried she, "but she is alive in spite of you, alive to denounce you and to punish you." She darted forward, and her eyes flashed lightning. "Look at this man, all of you!" she cried. "Look at him well. This is the wretch that scuttled the Proserpine." 62. "Oh, Miss Helen, how can you say that?" cried Nancy, in utter dismay. "I'll lay my life poor Joe never did such wickedness." But Helen waved her off without looking at her, and pointed at Wiley. "Are you blind? Why does he cringe and cower at sight of me? I tell you he scuttled the Proserpine, and the great auger he did it with I have seen and handled. Yes, sir, you destroyed a ship, and the lives of many innocent persons, whose blood now cries to heaven against you; and if I am alive to tell the cruel tale, it's no thanks to you; for you did your best to kill me, and what is worse, to kill Robert Penfold, this gentleman's son, for he was on board the ship. You are no better than an assassin." "I am a man that's down," said Wiley in a low and broken voice, hanging his head. "Don't hit me any more. I didn't mean to take anybody's life. I took my chance with the rest, lady, as I'm a man. I have lain in my bed many's the night, crying like a child, with thinking you were dead. And now I am glad you are alive to be revenged on me. Well, you see, it is your turn now. You have lost me my sweetheart there. She'll never speak to me again after this. Ah, the poor man gets all the blame. You don't ask who tempted me. And if I was to tell you, you'd hate me worse than ever. So I'll belay. If I'm a sinner, I'm a sufferer. England's too hot to hold me. I've only to go to sea, and get drowned the quickest way." And with this he vented a deep sigh, and slouched out of the room. Nancy sank into a seat, and threw her apron over her head, and rocked and sobbed as if her heart would break. As for Helen Rolleston, she still stood in the middle of the room, burning with excitement. Then poor old Michael came to her, and said almost in a whisper, "It is a bad business. He is her sweetheart, and she had the highest opinion of him." This softened Helen in a great measure. She turned and looked at Nancy, and said, "Oh, dear, what a miserable thing! But I couldn't know that." After a while she drew a chair and sat down by Nancy, and said, "I won't punish him, Nancy." Nancy burst out sobbing afresh. "You have punished him," said she brusquely, "and me too, as never did you no harm. You have driven him out of the country, you have." At this piece of feminine justice Helen's anger revived. "So then," said she, Ships are to be destroyed, and ladies and gentlemen murdered, and nobody is to complain, or say an angry word, if the wretch happens to be paying his addresses to you. That makes up for all the crimes in the world. What! Can an honest woman like you lose all sense of right and wrong for a man? And such a man!" "Why, he is as well made a fellow as I ever saw," sobbed Nancy. "Oh, is he?" said Helen, ironically. Her views of manly beauty were different, and black eyes a sine qua non with her. "Then it is a pity his soul is not made to correspond. I hope by my next visit you will have learned to despise him as you ought. Why, if I loved a man ever so, I'd tear him out of my heart if he committed a crime. Aye, though I tore my soul out of my body to do it." "No, you wouldn't," said Nancy, recovering some of her natural pugnacity. "For we are all tarred with the same stick, gentle or simple." "But I assure you I would," cried Helen, "and so ought you." "Well, miss, you begin," cried Nancy, suddenly firing up through her tears. "If the Proserpine was scuttled, which I've your word for it, Miss Helen, and I never knew you to tell a lie, why, your sweetheart is more to blame for it than mine." Helen rose with dignity. "You are in grief," said she. "I leave you to consider whether you have done well to affront me in your own house." And she was moving to the door with great dignity, when Nancy ran and stopped her. "Oh, don't leave me so, Miss Helen," she cried. "Don't you go to quarrel with me for speaking the truth too plain and rude, as is a plain spoken body at the best. And in such grief myself I scarce know what to say. But indeed and in truth, you mustn't go and put it abroad that the ship was scuttled. If you do, you won't hurt Joe Wiley. He'll get a ship and fly the country. Who you'll hurt will be your own husband as is to be, Wardlaw's." "Shall I, Mr. Penfold?" asked Helen disdainfully.
"Well, madam, certainly it might create some unworthy suspicion."
"Suspicion!" cried Nancy. "Don't you think to throw dust in my eyes? What had poor Joe to gain by destroying that there ship? You know very well he was bribed to do it, and risk his own life. And who bribed him? Who should bribe him but the man as owned the ship?"
"Miss Rouse," said Mr. Penfold, "I sympathize with your grief, and make great allowance. But I will not sit here and hear my worthy employer blackened with such terrible insinuations. The great house of Wardlaw bribe a sailor to scuttle their own ship, with Miss Rolliston and £160,000 worth of gold on board? Monstrous! Monstrous!"
"Then what did Joe Wiley mean?" replied Nancy. "Says he, 'The poor man gets all the blame. If I was to tell you who tempted me,' says he, 'you'd hate me worse.' Then I say why should she hate him worse? Because it's her sweetheart tempted mine. I stands to that."
This inference, thus worded, struck Helen as so droll that she turned her head aside to giggle a little. But old Penfold replied loftily, "Who cares what a Wiley says against a great old mercantile house of London City?"
"Very well, Mr. Penfolds," said Nancy with one great final sob, and dried her eyes with her apron. And she did it with such an air they both saw she was not going to shed another tear about the matter. "Very well. You are both against me. Then I'll say no more. But I know what I know."
"And what do you know?" inquired Helen.
"Time will show," said Nancy, turning suddenly very dogged. "Time will show."
Nothing more was to be got out of her after that, and Helen soon after made her a civil though stiff little speech, regretted the pain she had inadvertently caused her, and went away, leaving Mr. Penfold her address. On her return home she entered the whole adventure in her diary. She made a separate entry to this effect: "Mysterious. My letter to Mr. Penfold at the office intercepted. Wiley hints that he was bribed by Messrs. Wardlaw. Nancy Rouse suspects that it was Arthur, and says time will show."
As for me, I can neither see why Wiley should scuttle the ship unless he was bribed by somebody, nor what Arthur or his father could gain by destroying that ship. This is all as dark as is that more cruel mystery which alone I care to solve. 63. Next morning, after a sleepless night, Nancy Rouse said to Mr. Penfold, "Haven't I heard you say as bank notes could be traced to folk?" "Certainly, madam," said Michael, "but it is necessary to take the numbers of them." "Oh, and how do you do that?" "Why, every note has its own number." "La, ye don't say so? Then them 50s are all numbered belike?" "Certainly, and if you wish me to take down the numbers, I will do so." "Well, sir, some other day you shall. I could not bear the sight of them just yet, for it is them as has been the ruin of poor Joe Wiley, I do think."
Michael could not follow this; but, the question having been raised, he advised her, on grounds of common prudence, not to keep them in the house without taking down their numbers.
"We will talk about that in the evening," said Nancy.
Accordingly, at night, Nancy produced the notes, and Michael took down the numbers and descriptions in his pocket book. They ran from 16444 to 16463, and he promised her to try and ascertain through what hands they had passed. He said he had a friend in the Bank of England who might perhaps be able to discover to what private bank they had been issued in the first instance, and then those bankers, on a strong representation, might perhaps examine their books and say to whom they had paid them. He told her the notes were quite new and evidently had not been separated since their first issue. Nancy caught a glimpse of his meaning and set herself doggedly to watch until the person who had passed the notes through the chimney should come for them.
"He will miss them," said she. "You mark my words."
Thus Helen, though reduced to a standstill herself, had set an inquiry on foot which was alive and ramifying. In the course of a few days she received a visit from Mrs. Undercliff. The lady came in and laid a prayer book on the table, saying, "I have brought it you back, miss, and I want you to do something for my satisfaction." "Oh, certainly," said Helen. "What is it?" "Well, miss, first, examine the book and the writing." "Is it all right?" Helen examined it and said it was. "Indeed," said she, "the binding looks fresher, if anything." "You have a good eye," said Mrs. Undercliff. "Well, what I want you to do is Of course Mr. Wardlaw is a good deal about you?" "Yes." "Does he go to church with you ever?" "No." "But he would if you were to ask him?" "I have no doubt he would. But why?" "Manage matters so that he shall go to church with you, and then put the book down for him to see the writing, all in a moment. Watch his face, and tell me." Helen colored up and said, "No, I can't do that. Why, it would be turning God's temple into a trap. Besides—" "The real reason first, if you please," said this horribly shrewd old woman. "Well, Mr. Arthur Wardlaw is the gentleman I am going to marry." "Good heavens!" cried Mrs. Undercliff, taken utterly aback by this most unexpected turn. "Why, you never told me that." "No," said Helen, blushing. "I did not think it necessary to go into that. Well, of course it is not in human nature that Mr. Wardlaw should be zealous in my good work, or put himself forward, but he has never refused to lend me any help that was in his power; and it is repugnant to my nature to suspect him of a harm, and to my feelings to lay a trap for him." "Quite right," said Mrs. Undercliff. "Of course I had no idea you were going to marry Mr. Wardlaw. I made sure Mr. Penfold was the man." Helen blushed higher still, but made no reply. Mrs. Undercliff turned the conversation directly. "My son has given many hours to Mr. Hand's 2 letters, and he told me to tell you he is beginning to doubt whether Mr. Hand is a real person with a real handwriting at all." "Oh, Mrs. Undercliff! Why, he wrote me 2 letters. However, I will ask Mr. Penfold whether Mr. Hand exists or not. When shall I have the pleasure of seeing you again?" "Whenever you like, my dear young lady. But not upon this business of Penfold and Wardlaw.
I have done with it for ever. And my advice to you, miss, is not to stir the mud any more." And with these mysterious words the old lady retired, leaving Helen deeply discouraged at her desertion. However, she noted down the conversation in her diary, and made this comment: "People find no pleasure in proving an accused person innocent. The charm is to detect guilt. This day a good, kind friend abandons me, because I will not turn aside from my charitable mission to suspect another person as wrongfully as he I love has been suspected. Memo: to see or make inquiries about Mr. Hand." General Rolleston had taken a furnished house in Hanover Square. He now moved into it, and Helen was compelled to busy herself in household arrangements. She made the house charming, but unfortunately stood in a draught while heated, and caught a chill which a year ago would very likely have gone to her lungs and killed her, but now settled on her limbs in violent neuralgic pains, and confined her to her bed for a fortnight. She suffered severely, but had the consolation of finding she was tenderly beloved. Arthur sent flowers every day, and affectionate notes twice a day; and her father was constantly by her bedside. At last she came down to the drawing room, but lay on the sofa well wrapped up, and received only her most intimate friends. The neuralgia had now settled on her right arm and hand, so that she could not write a letter; and she said to herself with a sigh, "Oh, how unfit a girl is to do anything great! We always fall ill just when health and strength are most needed." Nevertheless, during this period of illness and inaction circumstances occurred that gave her joy. Old Wardlaw had long been exerting himself in influential channels to obtain what he called justice for his friend Rolleston, and had received some very encouraging promises; for the General's services were indisputable, and while he was stirring the matter, Helen was unconsciously cooperating by her beauty and the noise her adventure made in society. At last a gentleman whose wife was about the Queen, promised old Wardlaw one day, that if a fair opportunity should occur, that lady should tell Helen's adventure, and how the gallant old General, when everybody else despaired, had gone out to the Pacific, and found his daughter and brought her home. This lady was a courtier of 10 years' standing, and waited her opportunity; but when it did come she took it, and she soon found that no great tact or skill was necessary on such an occasion as this. She was listened to with ready sympathy, and the very next day some inquiries were made, the result of which was that the Horse Guards offered Lieutenant General Rolleston the command of a crack regiment and a full generalship. At the same time it was intimated to him from another official quarter that a baronetcy was at his service, if he felt disposed to accept it. The tears came into the stout old warrior's eyes at this sudden sunshine of royal favor, and Helen kissed old Wardlaw of her own accord; and the star of the Wardlaws rose into the ascendant, and for a time Robert Penfold seemed to be quite forgotten. The very day General Rolleston became Sir Edward, a man and a woman called at the Charing Cross Hotel, and asked for Miss Helen Rolleston. The answer was, she had left the hotel about 10 days. "Where is she gone, if you please?" "We don't know." "Why, hasn't she left her new address?" "No. The footman came for letters several times." No information was to be got here, and Mr. Penfold and Nancy Rouse went home greatly disappointed, and puzzled what to do. At first sight it might appear easy for Mr. Penfold to learn the new address of Miss Rolleston. He had only to ask Arthur Wardlaw. But, to tell the truth, during the last fortnight Nancy Rouse had impressed her views steadily and persistently on his mind, and he had also made a discovery that cooperated with her influence and arguments to undermine his confidence in his employer. What that discovery was we must leave him to relate. Looking then at matters with a less unsuspicious eye than heretofore, he could not help observing that Arthur Wardlaw never put into the office letter box a single letter for his sweetheart. "He must write to her," thought Michael, "but I am not to know her address. Suppose, after all, he did intercept that letter." And now, like other simple, credulous men whose confidence has been shaken, he was literally brimful of suspicions, some of them reasonable, some of them rather absurd. He had too little art to conceal his change of mind; and so very soon after his vain attempt to see Helen Rolleston at the inn, he was bundled off to Scotland on business of the office. Nancy missed him sorely. She felt quite alone in the world. She managed to get through the day, work helped her, but at night she sat disconsolate and bewildered, and she was now beginning to doubt her own theory. For certainly if all that money had been Joe Wiley's, he would hardly have left the country without it. Now the second evening after Michael's departure, she was seated in his room, brooding, when suddenly she heard a peculiar knocking next door. She listened a little while, and then stole softly downstairs to her own little room. Her suspicions were correct. It was the same sort of knocking that had preceded the phenomenon of the hand and bank notes. She peeped into the kitchen and whispered, "Jenny, Polly, come here." A stout washerwoman and the mite of a servant came, wondering. "Now you stand there," said Nancy, "and do as I bid you. Hold your tongues now. I know all about it." The myrmidons stood silent but with panting bosoms; for the mysterious knocking now concluded, and a brick in the chimney began to move. It came out, and immediately a hand with a ring on it came through the aperture and felt about. The mite stood firm, but the big washerwoman gave signs of agitation that promised to end in a scream. Nancy put her hand roughly before the woman's mouth. "Hold your tongue, you great soft!" and without finishing her sentence, she darted to the chimney and seized the hand with both her own and pulled it with such violence that the wrist followed it through the masonry, and a roar was heard. "Hold on to my waist, Polly!" she cried. "Jenny, take the poker and that string, and tie his hand to it while we hold on. Quick, quick! Are you asleep?" Thus adjured, the mite got the poker against the wall and tried to tie the wrist to it. This, however, was not easy, the hand struggled so desperately. However, pulling is a matter of weight rather than muscle, and the weight of the two women pulling downward overpowered the violent struggles of the man, and the mite contrived to tie the poker to the wrist, and repeat the ligatures a dozen times in a figure of 8. Then the owner of the hand, who had hitherto shown violent strength, taken at a disadvantage, now showed intelligence. Convinced that skill as well as force were against him, he ceased to struggle and became quite quiet. The women contemplated their feet with flushed cheeks and sparkling eyes. When they had feasted a reasonable time on the imprisoned hand, and two of them, true to their sex, had scrutinized a green stone upon one of the fingers, to see whether it was real or false, Nancy took them by the shoulders and bundled them good humoredly out of the room. She then lowered the gas and came out, and locked the room up, and put the key in her pocket. "I'll have my supper with you," said she. "Come, Jenny, I'm cook, and you make the kitchen as a body could eat off it, for I expect visitors." "La, ma'am," said the mite, "he can't get out of the chimbly to visit us through the street door." "No, girl," said Nancy, "but he can send a hambassador. So show her highs and plague her heart, as the play says, for of all the dirty kitchens give me hers. I never was there but once, and my slipper come off for the muck, as sticking to a body like bird-lime." There was a knock at Nancy's street door. The little servant, full of curiosity, was for running to it on the instant; but Nancy checked her. "Take your time," said she. "It is only a lodging-house keeper." Chapter 60 through 63